The night was soaked in rain, the kind that doesn't just fall but seems to bury the world beneath its weight, every droplet pounding like a gavel from above. Behind St. Augustine's Church, a young girl named Clarissa, just 17, staggered through the dark alleyway, her body racked with pain. She clutched her swollen belly with trembling hands, her hospital gown clinging to her frail frame, already drenched from the storm. There was no one left to call. Her parents had thrown her out when they found out she was pregnant. The father had vanished the day she told him, and the shelters were full. The church lights flickered, but never opened its doors. Her contractions came fast, breathless, like waves crashing too soon. She cried out, her voice swallowed by thunder, and collapsed behind the church's rusted dumpster, her only cradle. Alone, afraid, and soaked to the bone, she gave birth on the cold, wet ground with no help, no pain relief, no comfort but the hollow sound of rain hitting tin. The baby's first cry shattered the silence, louder than the bells inside the church had ever rung for her. She wrapped him in her hoodie, shaking violently. Tears mixed with rain as she looked into his eyes, wide, innocent, blameless. She named him Gabriel, not knowing why, only that something about him felt too pure for the world she lived in. She kissed his forehead once, and then, with hands that had never held anything so fragile, she placed him in a clean cardboard box she had found by the trash, gently tucking him in like a secret she had to bury. With one last look, she turned away, sobbing into her palms, her soul tearing in half. Inside the church, the choir was practicing, muffled hymns drifting through the stained glass. She whispered, "God, do something beautiful with him, please," then vanished into the rain like a ghost. Minutes later, Father Thomas stepped out to smoke his pipe in the alley, the one small sin he allowed himself, when he heard a cry louder than thunder. Confused, he followed the sound and found the baby, red-faced and wailing, haloed in rain and garbage. His breath caught. He picked up the box, stunned. Inside, wrapped in a soaked sweatshirt, was the most peaceful face he had ever seen. A note was taped to the sleeve. Asterisk, his name is Gabriel. Please don't let the world ruin him. Asterisk, that moment changed everything. The church became his first home, Father Thomas his reluctant guardian. The police tried to find the mother, but with no CCTV and no witnesses, she simply vanished. Gabriel grew up under the shadow of that steeple, his crib, once a donation box in a chapel basement. He learned to walk on chapel floors, speak with hymns in the background, and found his first friends among the choir boys and street orphans who wandered into Sunday school. But he wasn't just another orphan. From his earliest years, Gabriel had a calmness, a presence that made even angry men lower their voices. By the time he was 10, he could recite scripture better than the priests. By 15, he was organizing charity drives for the homeless. Every time he knelt in that chapel, his forehead to the same wooden floor where his mother once begged heaven for help, it was like he was carrying someone else's unanswered prayer, and he meant to answer it. And yet, Gabriel never knew who his mother was or why he was left there. All he had was that rain-soaked note, the name she gave him, a quiet longing that never quite faded. Every birthday, he lit a candle not for himself, but for the girl who gave him life and then disappeared. And somewhere, far away, Clarissa watched his life unfold through newspaper headlines and church bulletins she stole from cafes. She never stopped loving him. But her shame, her past, they chained her in silence. She whispered his name every night. She never stopped praying. Asterisk, let him become someone better than I ever was. Asterisk, she didn't know that prayer had already started to be answered. Because Gabriel, he wasn't just surviving, he was rising. But nothing could have prepared either of them for what was coming next. Because on the eve of his biggest announcement yet, something that would stun the entire church world, their lives were about to collide again in a way no one. Like, comment, and subscribe if you believe some prayers take years to bloom but never die. The night had scarred her in more ways than one. But the morning after, when Elena opened her eyes beneath the cold metal shelter of the bus stop 2 blocks away from the church, was when the true weight of her decision began to crack through her chest. Her trembling fingers gripped the edge of the bench, as if holding on to air could undo what had already been done. Her legs were blood-stained, aching, and her hospital gown was still damp from last night's rain. The church bell rang in the distance, and with each toll, it felt like the world was shouting her sin aloud. Elena Rodriguez, 22, with tangled black curls plastered to her pale, sweat-slicked forehead, had given birth behind a dumpster near a sacred place, and walked away from the infant she'd carried for 9 months. Her almond eyes, usually sharp and proud, were vacant now, staring into nothing. Last night, she had pressed a note inside the bundle of cloth that held her newborn. "Forgive me. Give him a life I can't." But now the silence was unbearable. She needed to know. She had to see if the baby survived. Every instinct screamed to run away, to disappear as planned, but her conscience, her mother's voice in her head, forced her back down that alley, her limbs shaking with every step. When she turned the corner, heart threatening to split her ribs, her knees buckled. The trash bin was open. Empty. The bundle was gone. Panic turned her stomach inside out. She dropped to the wet pavement, searching through the trash, sobbing with guilt. Had dogs gotten to him? Had someone thrown him out? A whisper in the wind made her turn her head. A soft voice. Then a figure. A nun, Sister Margaret, small-framed, wrapped in layers of gray wool, with a face like carved porcelain and eyes that had seen the darkest corners of the world, stood at the church door, holding something close. Elena couldn't breathe. Their eyes met. Time bent. Sister Margaret walked slowly toward her, a silent storm behind her serene expression. "He is alive," she said, her voice carrying the weight of judgment and mercy. Elena collapsed in tears, covering her face. She wasn't ready. She couldn't take the baby back. She didn't even have shoes on. She was just a shadow of herself. Sister Margaret didn't scold her. Instead, she offered a hand, gently placing it on Elena's shoulder. "You're not the first to be afraid," she whispered. "But this baby, he chose to breathe in a world that discarded him. That says something." Elena wanted to scream, to explain she had no job, no home, that the father was gone, that she hadn't even told her parents she was pregnant. But she said nothing, just sat there as the morning sun rose, watching Sister Margaret carry her child into the safety of the church, while she remained in the alley, stuck between heaven and despair. Days passed. Elena hovered like a ghost around the church, never going inside, always watching. She saw Sister Margaret feeding the baby, rocking him gently beneath the stained glass windows. She watched other nuns come and go. They named him Isaac. Isaac, like the boy nearly sacrificed by his father in the Bible. Elena thought the name was too holy for something born of sin. But every time she saw him, swaddled and calm, she questioned whether she had done the worst thing or the best. Then, one evening, just as the sky burned purple, a woman in a long black coat and square glasses walked into the church, holding a clipboard. Social worker. Elena followed her from the shadows, listening behind a cracked window. The baby was going to be placed into the system. No known parents. No ID. No medical history. He would be transferred within 48 hours. Elena's breath hitched. Was this really the end? She hadn't wanted to keep him, but now the idea of someone else taking him felt like her skin was being peeled away. The system chewed up children. Everyone knew that. And Isaac, he was so small, so quiet, so unwanted by the world except for that small church. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She found herself at the front steps of the church, kneeling. Not to pray, but to ask. Just ask. When Sister Margaret opened the door and saw her, there was no surprise in her eyes. Just a silent nod. Elena was let in. She didn't take the baby. She didn't speak much, but she cleaned the floor. She folded laundry. She worked. Every day. And when the social worker returned, Elena vanished out the back, watching from the shadows again. But Sister Margaret spoke boldly that day. "The baby has someone," she told the woman. "We're arranging guardianship through the church." The paperwork was already in motion. And just like that, Isaac's fate shifted. Not into the foster system, but into the arms of a church that didn't ask why he was born behind a dumpster, only that he had been born. Elena still didn't sign her name. She still refused to hold him. But she stayed. A ghost who cooked, cleaned, and wept silently behind the organ room. Every milestone, his first cough, his first laugh, his first tooth, was watched through a crack in the door. And when he first said, "Mama," at 11 months old, She ran to the basement and cried into her shirt for an hour. He had no idea, but he had found her, somehow, in the air around him. The church bells tolled as the sun cast golden light through stained glass windows. But inside St. Augustine's, the boy with no name, now Father Eli, stood alone, facing the cracked stone altar where he had first learned to pray. The silence of the sanctuary echoed louder than 1,000 voices. The very place where he once swept floors, arranged in books, and slept in the vestry now bore the weight of his faith and the truth he carried like a thorn in his soul. For years, he had searched for answers, piecing together his identity from scraps. A baby blanket with a faded monogram, a hospital wristband found in a sealed church file, and Sister Lenora's whispered apology on her deathbed. She had no choice, Eli. She loved you. She just couldn't keep you. That line haunted him like scripture. He had stared at his reflection for hours in the rectory mirror, wondering whose eyes he carried, whose lips curled when he smiled, whose pain he bore in his silence. The townsfolk respected Father Eli for his kindness, his sermons that bled raw truth, his gentle way with addicts and orphans, but none of them knew how often he woke up screaming, dreaming of metal trash bins, crying mothers, and a faceless woman running barefoot in the rain. It wasn't until a fire broke out in a local tenement, and he saved a trapped woman with a baby by smashing a boarded-up window, that the media swarmed in. Pictures of him carrying the child, his cassock singed and bleeding, went viral. Donations poured into the church. With it came something else, attention. A woman named Rhea from a nearby shelter saw the footage and froze. She'd been in the crowd that night, watching the rescue. But it wasn't the fire that stopped her breath. It was the face, the jawline, the brow, the scar above the left eyebrow, a tiny pale mark that matched the one she'd kissed as a newborn. She called the number at the bottom of the article a dozen times before hanging up, fingers trembling. Could it be? After all these years? But the fear, the crushing shame, held her hostage. She was now a house cleaner, quiet, sober for 12 years, living under a different name. Her past was a sealed vault she'd buried with every bleach-soaked rag and floor scrubbed. But that face, no, she had to know. Meanwhile, Father Eli received a letter. No return address. Just one sentence. Asterisk, did your mother ever tell you why she left you behind the church? Asterisk, the handwriting felt eerily familiar, like something seen once in a dream. He clutched the note for hours, eyes blurred from tears. There had been no record of her. No name, just Jane Doe. Yet now, a voice was calling through the veil of time. Across town, Rhea sat in the corner of her tiny apartment, clutching an old photo, one she'd never shown a soul. A baby, wrapped in her blue jacket, lying in a bin behind the church. She'd taken it before walking away that night. It was the last thing she had of him. The ache in her chest was back. After 26 years, it had never left. That night, as rain fell on the stained concrete outside her window, Rhea wrote a letter, one she'd sworn never to write. And the next morning, she mailed it. Across town, Father Eli stood at the altar again, staring at the pews, whispering a prayer. God, if my mother is still out there, let her find peace. Let her forgive herself. Let her know I survived. Let her know I love her, whoever she is. Neither of them knew that their letters were crossing paths at that very moment. On trucks, on highways, in sorting machines, both prayers waiting to collide in a truth that would change everything. And as the bells rang again, somewhere in the silence between each chime, destiny stirred. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The journey of forgiveness, truth, and divine grace is just beginning. 14 years passed. Rain-soaked mornings and hungry nights had molded young Elijah into a quiet but deeply observant boy, with thoughtful eyes the color of wet bark and a habit of standing still longer than most kids his age. He'd been adopted by an elderly couple, Margaret and Thomas Whitaker, two retired school teachers who had never had children of their own, but who believed in the quiet power of second chances. They'd taken Elijah in when he was just 6 months old, brought in by the nun who had found him in the trash bin, wrapped in a blood-stained towel that now lay folded in a small cedar box in his closet, the only link to his birth. Elijah was different. He never cried for toys or shouted in class. Instead, he watched. He listened. He spent hours sitting on the stone steps behind the church where he'd been left, watching the pigeons and whispering questions to the sky. Why did she leave me? Was it because she didn't love me? On the day he turned 14, Margaret handed him a box with trembling hands. Inside was the very towel he had been found in and a note, brittle with age. Asterisk. I'm sorry, baby. I hope you find a better world than the one I had. Asterisk. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He sat upright, clutching the note, staring at the ceiling, whispering, I forgive you, over and over again. A fire had started in him, not of rage, but of purpose. He told Margaret he wanted to serve, not just in the church, but in the lives of people who felt discarded like he had been. She cried quietly when he said it, pressing her old hand to his chest and saying, You already are, my boy. You already are. Meanwhile, across the city, Ruth, the mother who had left him, was now working night shifts cleaning office buildings. Her hands were scarred, her back bent, her face gaunt from years of guilt and insomnia. She had never stopped thinking about the baby she left in the trash bin. She never married, never had more children. Every birthday, she counted the candles alone. She even went back to that church once a year and sat behind it for hours, hoping to see someone, anyone, who looked like the baby she had given up. But no one ever came, until one spring morning. Ruth, now 40 years old with weathered eyes and hair that had grayed at the temples, sat outside the church holding a coffee cup, the steam curling around her like ghosts. A group of teens from the local parish passed by, laughing, tossing a ball. And behind them, walking with purpose, was Elijah, tall, lean, wearing a second-hand suit 2 sizes too big, holding a Bible against his chest like it was armor. Their eyes met for the first time. Neither spoke, but Ruth stood, and Elijah paused. Something ancient and aching filled the space between them. She stepped forward, her voice shaking. Do you know who I am? Elijah didn't blink. I think I've known for a while, he whispered. And for the first time in her life, Ruth's knees gave out, not from exhaustion, but from the unbearable weight of being seen. Elijah caught her gently, the same way he imagined a mother should have caught him. They sat on the church steps for hours. She told him everything, the abuse, the fear, the cold December night, the trash bin, the lullaby she sang before running away. Elijah listened without judgment. When she finished, he took her hand, stared into her shaking eyes, and said, You've gave me life, and then God gave me love. I got both. That's more than most. Ruth sobbed into his shoulder, and for the first time in 2 decades, she felt the warmth of grace. That night, Elijah stood in the old bedroom he grew up in and stared at the towel in the cedar box. He folded it again, tighter this time, like a promise. The past was not erased, but it was healed, stitched back together by forgiveness. And deep in the cracks of abandonment, something new had bloomed. Purpose, faith, and the beginning of a legacy. If you felt this part move you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because this story is just beginning to rise. The day of the news interview arrived, and Gloria watched the broadcast from her modest home, fingers trembling over her rosary beads as her son, now Bishop Elijah Thomas Wells, stood at a podium in front of thousands, speaking with humility and passion. Dressed in white clerical robes with deep maroon accents, the bishop's calm voice echoed across the auditorium and into homes as he told the world, for the very first time, about being born behind a church, discarded in a trash bin, and surviving. Elijah didn't name his mother, but every word struck Gloria like a wave crashing into her chest. He talked about faith being born out of abandonment, about the angels in disguise who pulled him from the brink, referring to the janitor, the nurses, the orphanage nun who read him bedtime stories. Watching from a dimly lit living room, Gloria collapsed to her knees, sobbing, gripping the floor, whispering, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Flashbacks haunted her. The night of rain, the alley soaked in filth and guilt, the rusting bin lid creaking as she left the crying infant swaddled in the torn shawl she'd stolen from the church pews. Elijah spoke of growing up with a shadow, always in his dreams, a woman running, crying, always out of reach. He called her the ghost of my beginning. Gloria gasped. That was her. The night she left him, She turned to look one last time before sprinting into the darkness. Elijah never saw her, but some part of him remembered. Meanwhile, in a parish on the other side of town, Reverend Martin, a close friend and mentor to Bishop Elijah, noticed something unusual in Gloria's eyes as she sat quietly in the back pew that Sunday. It was the third time she'd come in a week. Her eyes always searched, lingered on Elijah's portraits, and left wet marks on the hymnal pages. Martin approached her gently after the sermon, saying, "Is there something you wish to confess?" Gloria shook her head, but her voice cracked. "He looks like someone I used to know." That evening, Reverend Martin told Elijah about her, a woman who seemed broken, like someone hiding under the weight of years. Elijah's heart stirred. For days, he couldn't sleep. That week, he asked to meet her after service. Gloria showed up wearing the same gray coat from that night 28 years ago, now frayed and thin. She didn't speak at first, just stared at him. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her purse and slowly unwrapped a tattered piece of cloth, a swatch of the baby shawl. Elijah's breath caught. He stared at it, then at her, and slowly, as tears streamed down her cheeks, Gloria whispered, "I'm the reason you had to become stronger than most." For the first time in decades, silence wrapped around her not in shame, but in release. Elijah didn't move for a long time. Then, in one breathless moment, he stepped forward and held her. Not with anger, not with confusion, but with a grace she never believed she deserved. The air between them was still, warm, like the peace she'd prayed for each night but never expected to receive. That embrace lasted minutes, maybe hours, but in it, something healed. "I was never angry," Elijah said softly. "Somehow, I always knew you loved me in your own way." Gloria broke into a sob. "I prayed every day for this moment. I don't deserve your forgiveness." Elijah smiled faintly, his eyes moist. "We all come from something broken. That's how light gets in." That night, Gloria didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She just stared at the photograph she kept of Elijah from the newspaper, the boy who had become a man, the bishop who carried the cross of abandonment and turned it into a beacon. And she knew, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, there was still redemption for even the most broken of beginnings. Like, comment, and subscribe if this story moved you, because some stories remind us that even the darkest places can give rise to light. They called it the Day of Rededication. The sunlight poured through the high stained glass windows of St. Gabriel's Cathedral, like heaven had parted just for him. Bishop Elijah stood at the altar in his flowing white and gold vestments, the golden staff in his right hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of divine purpose surging through him. His eyes, deep brown and always filled with a quiet strength, searched the crowd until they found her. Sophia, in the front pew, her once wiry frame now soft with age, she sat with her hands folded tight and her eyes locked on his. Tears glistened beneath her weathered lashes, streaking down the face that had once been smeared with dirt behind a church dumpster, giving birth to him with nothing but pain, guilt, and a prayer. She looked radiant in a navy blue dress, borrowed, probably, but she held herself like a queen. And to him, she was. Elijah's voice rang through the ancient arches, steady and clear. "Before we begin, I want to speak from my heart," he said, and a hush fell across the pews packed with hundreds of people, parishioners, press, politicians, and priests. "Most of you know I was abandoned as a newborn. What you don't know is that the woman who left me is here today, and she didn't leave me out of cruelty. She left me because she believed it would give me a chance." The room froze in awe. Camera shutters clicked like the ticking of fate. Sophia's breath caught. Her fingers clutched the rosary in her lap. Elijah stepped down from the altar, his footsteps echoing like the slow rhythm of redemption. He stopped in front of her. "Mom," he said. A collective gasp moved through the audience. Sophia's lip quivered, and her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "I forgive you. I love you. And I thank you for giving me life." He reached for her hands, those same hands that once shook as she swaddled him in a torn blanket, those same hands that nearly dropped him into that dumpster but pulled back at the last second and laid him softly inside, tears falling on his face as she whispered, "I'm sorry. God, protect him." He pulled her to her feet and wrapped his arms around her. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in silent weeping. People stood, overcome, as the church bells rang in the distance. The scene was pure grace. Elijah led Sophia to the altar beside him and turned back to the congregation. "I wasn't raised by bitterness. I was raised by mercy." He gestured to Father Brennan, now retired, who had once found him screaming in that trash bin, wrapped him in a choir robe, and whispered, "You are not forgotten." The old priest sat nearby, wiping tears from his eyes. Today is not about titles, not about robes or rings. Today is about hope, about how God can take broken things and make them whole. After the ceremony, they walked together in the garden behind the church. Sophia bent down and touched the spot near the old dumpster that had long since been cleaned up and landscaped, now filled with lilies and sunflowers. "It was here," she whispered. Elijah kneeled beside her, his golden cross resting against his chest. "I know. I've always known." She looked at him, eyes wide. "Ow!" He touched his heart. "Something in me always brought me back here, like a thread pulling me home." The media tried to approach them, but Elijah gently waved them off. This was not a story for headlines. It was a story for the soul. That evening, Sophia came to his modest bishop's residence for dinner. He cooked for her chicken adobo, the way she said her mother used to make it in the Philippines. She laughed softly, the sound like wind chimes in the twilight. "You cook better than I ever did." He smiled. "I had a good teacher life." At the end of the night, as she prepared to leave, she paused at the doorway. "Don't deserve your kindness," she said. He shook his head. "You don't have to earn love, Mom. You just receive it." She hugged him once more, tightly this time, like she was holding her second chance. As she disappeared into the night, Elijah looked up at the stars. He wasn't born in a hospital. He wasn't raised by blood, but he was a child of grace. And now, as Bishop Elijah Cruz, he would spend his life proving that no one is ever truly thrown away. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable true stories.